This is part 2 of Chapter 55's lecture on ecosystems, and we left off talking about decomposers. And these two pictures are showing two examples of decomposers. One are bacteria, and the other are fungi. So now on to the next cycle, which is the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus is a major component of nucleic acids, of phospholipids, and a major part of ATP. And phosphate, PO4 with a negative charge, is the most important inorganic form of phosphorus. The largest reservoirs are sedimentary rocks of marine origin, oceans, and organisms. Phosphate binds with soil particles, and the movement is often localized. The phosphorus cycle is much slower than the carbon or nitrogen or even water cycle. So this one, because it does have its major reservoir in solid rock or sedimentary rock, and since it does bind with soil particles, it does take longer to circulate through the cycle. The way that it enters the food chain is simply through erosion, which releases soluble phosphate to be taken up by plants. Now, the water cycle you should be familiar with, but we'll just spend a couple minutes on it. It's essential to all organisms, and we will actually spend time studying it when we go into our biochemistry unit. But liquid water is the primary physical phase in which water is used in each ecosystem. The oceans contain 97% of the biosphere's water. 2% of that water is then found in glaciers or polar ice caps, and only 1% is found in lakes, rivers, and groundwater. Water is going to move through its cycle through the process of precipitation, transpiration, evaporation. There is some movement of it through runoff as well. Another part of this cycle is condensation, although that won't be quite as involved in the cycling. But evaporation is the main way that it returns to its reservoir, which is generally its reservoir in the clouds and in the atmosphere. But it also is going to return to its reservoirs in the oceans or any body of water through precipitation. What is transpiration? So I want to just take a minute to review that really quickly. Transpiration occurs through the leaves of trees, through the stomata in particular of trees. And what happens is a tree, and it actually helps the flow of water up through the tree. So, of course, water moving from its roots up to the leafy part of a tree is going against gravity. And so the way that that is occurring is that transpiration actually is allowing that water to be drawn up. So the water in the stomata are actually heated up through the heat of the sun and evaporated. And that process actually then uses cohesion and adhesion properties of water to then draw the water up through the entire vascular system of the tree. And this picture is showing how the reverse is happening in terms of converting light energy through photosynthesis into sugars, which are then transported down the tree. So the water cycle, as you know, again, is very important. And there are things that human impact contributes to that actually break up that cycle. And one of the biggest problems is deforestation. because of the effect that it's going to have on transpiration as you take away trees. um, you have the groundwater not transpired up into the atmosphere. So that link that we generally would share with evaporation of getting groundwater from one reservoir to the other is totally wiped out. And so we get actually a breaking down of the water cycle, because then precipitation cannot be created in the clouds if you're not getting enough water up into the atmosphere. That process when we go from forest to desert is called desertification. So this is just a graph showing the effect. We end up with a 40% increase in runoff of water. So that water, again, is not being pulled into the roots of a tree system. If we've taken out the trees of a forest, the water that normally would be absorbed into the soil is not, because again, that whole transpiration process is being driven by the needs of the leafy structure of a tree, needing to pull the water up through the roots into the leaves to then transpire into the atmosphere. So again, if you wipe out your trees, then what's going to happen is the water is not going to go into the soil because there's no draw from the roots, and the water just runs off. And then when you actually have runoff of water, you're also taking other geochemical cycle nutrients with it. So, for example, the nitrate levels in runoff are very high. So the nitrate in the soil actually is being leached out of the soil through this runoff. So again, we then have this um, stepping stone effect or a domino effect of the different geochemical cycles being affected. So we've looked at how nutrients cycle through the ecosystems, and now we're going to spend a little bit of time on how energy flows through those same ecosystems. This should be a review from earlier biology, so we'll move more quickly through this. But we have these different levels, trophic levels of energy flow. And the first level starts with the autotrophs, who build their own molecules of energy, their carbon compounds, using photosynthesis or chemosynthesis as an energy source. And then after the autotrophs, we have the heterotrophs. Heterotrophs meaning they eat other. So what heterotrophs have to do is depend on the biosynthetic output of other organisms. So either the primary consumers are going to be the herbivores who depend on producers to have made that carbon compound for them to consume, or if we have a secondary consumer like a carnivore, they have to rely on the primary consumers having gotten their energy source from the producers. So we have this general level and step up, and we make a pyramid of this energy flow. The energy and nutrients pass from level to level, primary producer to primary consumer to secondary consumer, and then on to perhaps tertiary, and sometimes, not very often, we have quaternary consumers in this food chain. Step of the way, you do have a loss of energy, which explains why, as we step up in this pyramid structure, each level becomes smaller because there's less energy available to each consumer level. So this gives us our basic format for a food chain. So a food chain, again, is a way of depicting trophic. These trophic levels are feeding relationships. Start with the energy from the sun. That's the energy flow is going to start from the sun down to the that energy is captured by the plants, and they're the first level of all food chains, whether they're terrestrial or marine. The food chains usually can only go up 4 or 5 levels, so I would say even 3 or 4, because of that inefficiency of energy transfer. So that law of entropy that we were talking about earlier, where we have this general move towards disorder, and what's happening is a loss of heat and the energy that's available from level to level allows or doesn't allow for the levels to have as large a population. um, they cannot be sustained because there's just not as much food energy for them from level to level. The last portion of this food chain has to include, we'll finish up our food chain here. The primary level is, or each of these levels are going to connect to the decomposer level. So we have that pictured here where they're all going to provide detritus or death of the entire organism that has to be cleaned up by our decomposers. So that has to be a big part of this food chain and connects food chains with the nutrient cycling. Enough of that. So the inefficiency of energy transfer. Um, Basically, what that is stating is that very little energy actually makes it from one level to the other. And so you've heard the statistics where we have between 5 to 10% of energy available from one trophic level to the next. So the question is, what happens to the other 90% of the energy? And the loss of that energy really is accounted for by looking at what is here. A lot of it is through cellular respiration. So when we think of the heat is being generated by the organism's body actually going through cellular respiration and expending energy to do that. 17% of the energy loss is estimated to be due to just simply growth of the organism, but the vast majority, 50%, is just waste product. So there is a lot of inefficiency of energy that is just lost through feces. Silly sounds. Sorry, I have to apologize for those. So the part that goes into growth is the only energy that's available to the next level of the food chain. So energy and other limiting factors control the primary production in an ecosystem. So this is the second section of your chapter 55. And what the book's main concepts are in this section include what most ecosystems, primary production is the amount of light energy converted to chemical energy by autotrophs during a given time. So these are some definitions that you should be familiar with. So the definition for primary production. In a few ecosystems, there are chemoautotrophs, which make up the primary producers. Also, the extent of the photosynthetic production is going to set how much energy is available as a budget for the entire ecosystem. So that first primary level of the trophic, primary producer level of the trophic system is setting actually the entire ecosystem's limits in terms of its size and growth, what can be sustained. So that carrying capacity that we talked about earlier in population ecology is very much being determined by the producers of an environment or of an ecosystem. Also, the amount of solar radiation that reaches the Earth's surface is going to play a part in this because it's going to limit how much photosynthesis goes on. And only a small fraction of the sun's energy actually strikes the photosynthetic portions of organisms that can do photosynthesis. And even less of that light energy is the correct wavelength for photosynthesis. So we have this, again, trickling down of available energy, even starting from our first source of energy being sunlight.